by a bipartisan deal that originated, thankfully, in the Senate. We will have to, in order to find a long-term budget solution, be willing to bring that same spirit to the table. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
I will withhold.
The senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I have one unanimous consent request for a committee to meet during today's session of the Senate. It's the approval of both the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that the request be agreed to and that the request also be printed in the record.
Without objection.
And with that, Mr. President, note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. As we wait for a senator to speak, the New York Times is writing that Senate Democratic and Republican leaders reached a final agreement on a deal to reopen the government and extend its borrowing authority into February. The paper writing that final passage is expected late Wednesday or pre-dawn on Thursday. Under that agreement, the government would be funded through January 15th, and the debt ceiling would be raised until February 7th. The Senate will take up a separate motion calling on House and Senate negotiators to reach an agreement on a long-term deficit reduction plan. Those are the terms of the agreement, the deal between Senate Democrats and Republicans. We want to find out if you think this is a good deal. You can go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/tspan, to let us know. At the White House briefing today, Jay Carney talked about the deal. That briefing happened around 1 p.m. Eastern Time.
You don't have a special guest.
Three deputies. This is pretty much the entirety of the press office staff today. It is a smile. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here, as ever. We can go right to questions because I have no announcements to make, although I'm sure I know what you're going to ask. Julie.
All right, so can you please give us the White House reaction to the Senate deal that was struck today?
The President believes that the bipartisan agreement announced by the leaders of the United States Senate will reopen the government and remove the threat of economic brinksmanship that has already harmed middle-class families, American businesses, and our country's economic standing in the world. The President applauds Leader Reid and Minority Leader McConnell for working together to forge this compromise and encourages the Congress to act swiftly to end this shutdown and protect the full faith and credit of the United States of America.
And I assume that means that he supports the provisions that are included in that, including the 2 dates for opening the government and raising the debt ceiling?
Well, he does. He believes that this agreement achieves what's necessary in terms of reopening the government and removing the threat of default and the kind of brinksmanship that we've seen. Again, we haven't seen legislation move through either house at this point, but so we're not issuing an official statement of administration policy, but he looks forward to Congress acting so that he can sign legislation that will reopen the government and remove this threat from our economy.
Is he confident that both the Senate and the House will be able to vote on this measure today?
We leave parliamentary procedures to the Congress. We obviously hope that each House will be able to act swiftly because we're already on day 16, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, of a wholly unnecessary shutdown of government with real consequences for real people. And we are obviously very close to the point beyond which the United States Treasury no longer has the authority to borrow new money to meet our obligations. So as soon as possible is essentially the recommendation we have from here.
Since we are so close to that deadline, are there any operations or procedures that are going in place today to prepare for the possibilities that Congress cannot pass this measure today?
The Treasury is the place that would answer questions like that. What I can tell you is what Secretary Lew has made clear in his testimony and in his letter to Congress, and that is that the Treasury Department will exhaust borrowing authority at the end of the day tomorrow, Thursday, October 17th, and that beyond that point, the Treasury would have only cash on hand. It would not be able to borrow new money to meet obligations. Jeff.
Jay, how confident is the White House that the House will pass this deal?
We are not putting odds on anything. We're simply applauding the leaders of the Senate for reaching the agreement that they've reached and calling on both houses of Congress to act swiftly, to take action to ensure that the government reopens. And the threat of default is removed, and that the continuing harm that these two situations have caused to our economy can stop.
The President has said from the beginning that he would not negotiate on this. Now that it looks like there is a deal, do you feel like he fulfilled that pledge?
What the President made clear was his position is that he would not allow a situation to develop where he paid ransom to any party in Congress that was trying to extract unilateral political concessions in return for Congress fulfilling its fundamental responsibilities. And he believes that's the right position for him to take, that it was the right position, it is the right position, and it's the right position for presidents of the future to take, because our economy is extremely dependent on the faith and credit that is invested in it by investors around the world. In other words, there is a real, even if intangible, value to the safeness of investing in the United States. And as we've discussed many times over the past days and weeks, threatening that does real harm. And obviously, default would cause even more harm. But we've already seen there is already a price that has been paid, as we saw in 2011, and we've seen again now in the various ways that the flirtation with crossing that line and flirting with default has brought about consequences. So he felt and feels that it's the right position to take, and again applauds the leaders of the Senate for coming together and working out a bipartisan solution.
Is there any concern, even with this deal being made, that a downgrade from some of the credit rating agencies could still be pending?
Well, I would refer you to Treasury for those kinds of assessments. I think that we focus on the things we can control, which is calling on Congress to quickly act on this compromise agreement and ensure that the government reopens and that the threat of default is removed.
And lastly, this is leading to additional budget talks later this year. Once those talks are underway, will the White House and will the President insist that revenue continue to be on the table?
The President has insisted that in these budget negotiations that he's been calling for all year, everything has to be on the table. And that will be his position going forward. What he believes is a fair approach to resolving our budget challenges is reflected in the budget he submitted. He knows that even though that was a compromise proposition from the beginning and reflected the offer he made to Speaker Boehner at the end of last year, that he will not get in a budget negotiation everything he wants, and neither will Democrats and neither will Republicans, and that's the nature of compromise. But he firmly believes that balance, when it comes to further reducing our deficits and building on the work that has been done over these past 4 years in which we have reduced our deficits by half, we need to continue to take a balanced approach so that no sector of society unfairly has to bear the brunt of that project. That's always been his position, and it will be his position moving forward.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks, Jay. Can you just give us a little color how the President was informed of the deal, who told him, what his reaction was?
No.
None?
Right now, Brianna, I think we're looking to Capitol Hill for action to be taken. The President, as you know, has been in contact with leaders in Congress, as have members of his team, and we are encouraged by the progress that we've seen and hope that it is fulfilled through votes in both the Senate and the House.
Can you give us any more about how he was involved in the process?
Well, as I've said, and as you know, he's had meetings with leaders of Congress. He's had phone calls with leaders of Congress. He invited all members of both houses to the White House. And it is also the case that we don't inform you of every phone call that he makes, either to members of Congress or to others. So he's been engaged in this process. His team has been engaged in this process. Ultimately, our position has been consistent and clear, and therefore not that complicated to communicate either to you or the public or to Congress. We have simply urged all sides to, put down sort of, or put aside, the efforts to achieve partisan advantage and leverage, and instead to move forward with an agreement that opens the government and raises the debt ceiling so that the threat of default does not hang over us at the time, at this time.
The President said yesterday, basically once this whole mess was resolved, he said, once that's done, the day after, I'm going to be pushing to say, call a vote on immigration reform. Does he really think that a recipe for success on immigration reform, one divisive issue, is to deal with it right after another divisive issue is
The President believes that one of the consequences of these manufactured crises is that time is taken away from the pursuit of other goals that we have as a nation, and that includes economic goals that go to the heart of his agenda to build a better, building a better bargain for the middle class, and it goes also to the project of bringing about legislation that he can sign that comprehensively reforms our immigration system in this country. Now, that legislation passed the Senate with a significant bipartisan majority, and he absolutely believes that the House ought to take up that legislation and pass it. And as we've discussed in recent days, that's not a partisan pursuit. It's the opposite of a partisan pursuit. One, because it requires votes from both parties, and it also would benefit both parties.
Does he think pushing it right away increases the chances of yielding a result that he might be amenable
I think
to?
the President was simply reflecting that, unfortunately, even though we've been pushing for comprehensive immigration reform all year long, and it's been a major priority, there is no question that the decision by the House to shut the government down and to flirt with default has forced him and everyone in Congress to pay attention to those problems and to those crises rather than the many other things that we could and should be working on, and immigration reform is one of them. And I don't think, again, there are many, many proponents of comprehensive immigration reform in the Republican Party and within the broader Republican universe. So this is not a, he's not saying that he wants to come out and push some Democratic agenda item. He wants to continue the effort that has been underway all year to try to pass a bipartisan comprehensive immigration reform legislation that would strengthen the economy, help our middle class, reduce the deficit, and make us more competitive in the future. So that is one of the many priorities that he will be pushing, and he hopes members of Congress will be pushing once we can move past these unfortunate and unnecessary crises.
He thinks he has a better shot to do that right now, though?
Oh, well, again, I don't think that I can sort of place, quantitative odds on the prospects of any of this. Congress is a difficult institution to make predictions about. So our view is simply that it's the right thing to do, and we're going to push for it. And we think there's a strong argument to be made on a whole array of areas when it comes to immigration reform. It's the economically right thing to do. It's the right thing to do when it comes to deficit reduction. It's the right thing to do when it comes to ensuring that the best and the brightest from around the world who come here and get an education stay here and start businesses. It's the right thing to do when it comes to further strengthening our border security. So there's something in that bill for everyone, and which is why it's the right thing for America. John.
Just one, got to try on phone conversations. When was the last time the President spoke to the Speaker of the House?
I don't have any new conversations to read out to you, but as I've noted many times, so don't read anything specific into this, the President has conversations with members of Congress that we do not read out in all cases. So at this time I have no readouts to provide.
Does the President have an assurance from the Speaker of the House that the House will vote on this
I would refer you to the House in terms of actions that the House may or may not take.
Does the President expect the Speaker to bring this up for a vote?
The President hopes that both Houses will act swiftly on this agreement in order to reopen the government and remove the threat of default and this continued brinksmanship from, the harm it's causing to this economy. I'm not sure that was a great sentence, but I apologize. You understand what I'm trying to say.
I totally understand. Does this agreement represent...
I can't even... The Red Sox game wasn't even late, so I can't blame that.
Does this agreement...
But, since I'm speaking about the Red Sox, how about John Lackey, huh? Pretty good.
Moving on.
Moving on.
Does this agreement represent a complete win for the White House?
There are no winners here. We've said that from the beginning, and we're going to say it right up to the end because it's true. The American people have paid a price for this. And nobody who's sent here to Washington by the American people can call themselves a winner if the American people have paid a price for what's happened. And the economy has suffered because of it, and it was wholly unnecessary. And let's just remind ourselves that we're not even out of it yet. This is not done. We need action to be taken so that the government can reopen and the threat of default can be removed.
The President, or in this agreement, is there a little bit of ransom pay? I mean, there is a provision in here that requires verification for recipients of subsidies under the Affordable Care Act.
The income verification provision to which you refer was negotiated by Senate Democrats and Senate Republicans and is a modest adjustment to the existing Affordable Care Act law. We have always said we are willing to make improvements and adjustments to the law. Ransom would be a wholly different thing. And
well, it's a little bit of ransom.
No,
because it's something that was done with the gun on the table or the
not if
atomic bomb.
Both sides agree to it and we support it. We're fine with it.
Okay, and then I'm very quick to just factual things on the Affordable Care Act. Can you give us some updated figures on web traffic? You were very free with this in the first few days, so where are we now?
Here's what I can tell you. Today we are 2 weeks into the implementation of the Affordable Care Act's health insurance marketplace, where Americans, regardless of their income, job status, or age, or health status, can access quality, affordable health coverage they can rely on. Healthcare reform is more than a website. Across the country, people are getting health insurance. Although the glitches are unacceptable, so is the idea of leaving millions of Americans on their own, including families across the country who now have access to health care that they did not have 2 weeks ago. I noted that on one network today that there was a suggestion that that network could not find a single story of someone enrolling, which was ironic because they're all over the rest of the media, including in Delaware, a small business owner found a plan that cost her $150 less than the cost of her previous plan. Again, these are other media reports. We don't, not information we're collecting or disseminating. The Kaiser Health News refers to a college student who will pay $70 a month after federal subsidies, the same amount he is currently paying, but for much broader coverage in this case. And he says, "I'm thrilled to get something this good at that price. It was a complete surprise." In New Mexico, a business owner signed up his employees and got quoted a policy that will save $1,000 per month. This is the owner of a law firm in New Mexico. And I mentioned some other stories. And these are just stories that reflect that despite the glitches that we acknowledge and that absolutely must be fixed, people are getting on and enrolling. They are finding an enormous array of options available to them that weren't available to them in the past. And we are focused on consumers here. And consumers are just regular Americans out there who want the option of being able to buy affordable health insurance. And what we're seeing from the anecdotes that have been reported are that people are finding those options available to them and are excited about them. And the volume that we've seen reflects the fact that the interest is extremely high. And you know, that volume continues. I don't have in front of me, maybe I can find it for you. It continues to be extremely high. We have 560,000 calls have been made to the Marketplace call center, and I'm sure I just have a lot of material here. I know that the the numbers of people coming to the website remain
So you'll get the
extremely high.
You'll get the updated numbers. And do you have even an estimate for me now? We're 2 weeks into this.
We've said
of how
repeatedly,
many
John,
people
that we will
have
release
enrolled?
enrollment figures monthly, so I would expect the first figures to come out in mid-November.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Jay, I understand what you were saying about there's no winners, but clearly the White House and the President wanted to establish a new norm. No reopening of the government with what you consider to be partisan legislative attachments, avoiding to follow with the same approach. Has that strategy been vindicated, and you believe 16 days of shutdown was worth that effort to achieve that, what
The
you hope to
shutdown
be a
was
new
wholly
norm?
unnecessary, and this was a manufactured crisis. The President's position from the beginning was that Congress ought to pass a continuing resolution at existing funding levels. He made no requests associated with that, demanded no concessions in return for signing a legislation that would extend government funding to allow for broader budget negotiations. So,
but he did want to push back on the idea that you could use either one of these pieces of these deadlines as leverage. Has that been
the President
vindicated
believes that it was the
and
right
worth it?
position to take, and it remains the right position to take, that especially when it comes to the full faith and credit of the United States, that neither he nor any of his successors can allow a dynamic to take root where raising the debt ceiling is used as leverage, or the refusal to raise the debt ceiling is used as leverage to try to achieve some partisan policy objective.
And do you believe this now settles that question?
Again, we don't have a bill to sign. So we're not in a position here to even say that the government has been reopened or the debt ceiling has been lifted. So I think hopefully when we do, we can have a fuller discussion about what comes next. So I don't want to get ahead of where we are today. We are pleased with the progress made in the Senate and the agreement announced by Leaders Reid and McConnell today, and very much appreciate the bipartisan effort underway in the Senate that reflects, we believe, a model for how we can move forward. And after all, this has only been about basic stuff: funding the government, making sure the United States pays its bills. We will have, hopefully, serious substantive negotiations around a broader budget agreement. And in that process, hopefully there'll be a willingness to compromise by both sides. And if that is the case, then perhaps we can reach a broader budget agreement that will settle some of these disputes in a way where nobody gets everything he or she wants, but the American people win because there is increased certainty and necessary investments to help our economy grow and protect and expand the middle class. And that's what we seek here. And we think that those are goals that really have been and can be shared by members of both parties.
Those negotiations in a second. Can the country anticipate hearing from the President when this process finishes itself on Capitol Hill?
I don't have any scheduling announcements to make when it comes to the President. Obviously, he's been very much engaged in this and has spoken publicly about it rather frequently. So we'll have to see once we have a resolution as to what format his first comments about it will take.
Logistically, is it important once the legislation is completed, when it is completed, that it get over here right away to avoid this scenario that the Treasury Secretary has laid out, or do you think there's some time, 24, 48 hours, it's not an urgent matter that the legislation get here?
I think that the uncertainty that has already been created has caused harm to our economy, and I'm just citing the financial press and saying that. This is not some inside information. We know it based on what's been reported. So the sooner, as soon as possible is the approach, is the ask that we're making of Congress. Act swiftly. The problem with reaching the debt ceiling, the problem with reaching that date where beyond which the United States no longer has the authority to borrow new money, is that it is uncharted territory. And
There's a degree of urgency to avoid that.
You know, I would
being
point you
hit.
to what Secretary Lew and others have said about this, and simply urge Congress to act swiftly.
On the negotiations, once they occur, is it the highest priority of the White House to undo or redraw sequestration?
The President has many priorities reflected in his budget. I think the President believes we ought to set budget policy in a way that makes wise choices about how we invest, and sequester definitely does not fit the bill in that, because it was sort of mindless across the board cuts that, I mean, by design, that took away from lawmakers and policymakers the ability to make wise choices about how we fund our government and what investments we make so that the economy can grow, and what programs provide the best bang for the taxpayer dollar when it comes to growth and job creation. So we certainly
from August about we need to invest, and we're not going to be so obsessed with deficit reduction. It's important, but we're going to try to deal with other investments. You take those speeches all throughout August, this agreement, push it up to January 15th when the next layer of sequestration cuts really begin to bite in a new and fundamentally different way. It wouldn't be fair to deduce that that's the #1 priority, to redraw those numbers.
Well, again, I don't think it's all about sequester. The President's budget has savings that completely eliminate the sequester and then exceed it when it comes to deficit reduction. So it is clearly his belief, as a belief shared by many Republicans, that the cuts created by sequester are done with an axe instead of a scalpel, or a cleaver instead of a scalpel, and they thereby do harm unnecessarily to various aspects of our government and our economy. And we ought to do better. We ought to come together and negotiate a broader budget agreement in which everybody can agree on where to cut, how to reduce the deficit, where to invest, and plus up some programs because they're good for the economy and good for the middle class, good for educating our children and investing in our future. And from that, we can strengthen the foundation that we've built already for economic growth in the future. Ed.
Jay, on the following on Major's question about the strategy of not negotiating over default and whether or not that's been vindicated. During the campaign, the President also talked about if he won the election, he would break this Republican fever he thought was there to sort of not work with him. With this deal, do you think he's made any progress in breaking that fever, or have Ted Cruz and other Republicans kind of driven both sides further apart?
It's a great question, and I think it's fair to say that the experience that we've all had demonstrates that the kind of hyper-partisanship that was a problem in the past, especially in one house, continues to be a challenge, and that when pursued at the expense of good governance and the American people, it does harm to our economy and just causes dysfunction here in Washington. It's a way of asking, a good way, but a way of asking the same question that was asked before, which is, how do we, what odds do we set on cooperation and bipartisan compromise in the future? And I don't think we would put odds on that. We would simply hope that this experience, if and when it's over, would remind all of us here that these kinds of crises only create harm to the American people and to the American economy. There are costs that have already been incurred because of shutdown, because of the flirtation with default, and they're not retrievable. So we ought to instead focus on making progress instead of creating all this unnecessary conflict. So, but whether or not this experience will lead to different choices in the future is really a question for members of Congress.
But on the last part of
ask that the call of the quorum be vacated, and I consume such time as necessary.
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I come to the floor today with both a great deal of energy and a sense of relief. Relief that it appears that we've reached a bipartisan agreement to reopen the government, pay America's bills, and give us a path forward to deal with the ability to negotiate on some of our long-term fiscal challenges. I come with a sense of energy because I think it shows that when there's a will, we find a way, and this seems to be a sensible approach to do this. I have a sense of optimism that this spirit of compromise that produced this new agreement will continue in the Senate as we work together. Mr. President, I'm so relieved that we're going to extend the debt limit at least to February 7th, 2014. During this entire debate over the last several days, I just was so apprehensive that America would become a deadbeat nation. I was appalled, like so many Americans, that 4 of our soldiers who had fallen in the line of duty were not going to, their families were not going to get their death benefit. And the wonderful Fisher family that's been so kind and so generous to our veterans paid that. This is the United States of America. We have a duty to our military. We have a duty to our military families. And we were going to not be able to do that. And that was just one example. I was concerned that our T-bills, our famous Treasury bills, that have been not only been part of the fiscal underpinnings of the global economy, but also have given confidence to modest and conservative investors. Well, I'll invest in T-bills because nothing will ever happen to our government. I was concerned that our T-bills would go the way of junk bonds. So now, because we've extended the debt limit, we've agreed to pay the bills on debt that we've already incurred. This is an excellent way of moving forward. I also am pleased that we're going to have, as part of this agreement, the reopening of the entire government. This means that our government will be on a continuing funding resolution to January 15th, 2014. Now, this will enable us to really set the framework for what our funding will be for the rest of the fiscal year. Now, remember why we are in a shutdown of our federal government. The presiding officer is a member of the Appropriations Committee. I chair that committee. That's the committee that actually puts money in the federal checkbook for the entire fiscal year. However, we're not wild spenders. We have a cap placed on us, and that's to come from the Budget Committee. The Budget Committee sets the budget for the entire federal government. It sets what the cap should be on discretionary spending. That's the Appropriations Committee. On mandatory spending, which are programs that must be funded, whether it's Social Security, Medicare, veterans benefits, and others, that no matter what, they are to be funded. And then they also set what revenue we should have and where we should get it. So the Budget Committee is absolutely crucial so that we can get on with our work. I'm pleased that there's been a commitment from the leaders to appoint conferees on the budget resolution so that the Budget Committee can do its work and give back to we appropriators no later than December 13th what our cap is for the spending for the entire fiscal year. If we can do that, we appropriators can do our job. I'll say more about what that appropriations is. Now, this is going to be a really tight schedule. The Budget Committee, which has been unable to meet because 6 senators used their parliamentary tools to block the Budget Committee meeting, even though the Senate passed with over 70 votes a budget on March 23rd. So we've now kind of wasted 6 months. So we don't want to waste the next 6 weeks. So I'm pleased that there appears to be the ability for the Budget Committee to meet in conference with the House of Representatives. That means the chair of the United States Senate Budget Committee, Senator Patty Murray, and the ranking member or vice chairman, Senator Jeff Sessions of Alabama, will meet with Paul Ryan, the Republican in the House, and Chris Van Hollen, another Marylander and a very able ranking member of the Budget Committee there. And I wish them well, because we need to have how much discretionary spending we're going to have, and we need to be able to look at mandatory spending, and we need to take a look at revenues. But right now, if we can pass this agreement arrived at by our leadership on both sides of the aisle, the Democratic leader, Senator Reid, the Republican leader, Senator McConnell, we can, within the next hours, reopen the government. We can pay our bills. These are our constitutional responsibilities. The American people deserve a government that works as hard as they do. We need to put our federal government and our federal employees back to work. This agreement does just that. It says to the American taxpayer and to the entire world, America is not a deadbeat nation. We can work together to enact bipartisan, fiscally responsible legislation to keep our government going. There is no doubt that we have significant fiscal challenges ahead of us. But, Mr. President, as we get prepared to vote on this, I would encourage all of us to take stock of what has happened here the last several days. It's time that we take stock of where we are and what it means. The crisis that we've just lived through might be very good for TV ratings, but it's lousy for credit ratings. Good for TV ratings because the nation was gripped by what they saw. They couldn't believe it. I was here working, and I couldn't believe it either, that we could not, in a straightforward way, come to grips with the fact that we needed to reopen government, but we were being held up for those who wanted to defund Obamacare. Now, this crisis of the shutdown of the United States government and the fear that the United States government might not pay its bills has created a crisis of confidence. As we work on implementing the deal that we're promoting, we have to also work to ensure that we rebuild the confidence of the American people and those who depend and look to the United States government, who are treasured allies, and emerging nations that we say, be a democracy and be like us. We've got to use our time not only to get our fiscal act together, but we have to restore the confidence in our ability to govern. America is a middle-of-the-road nation. We need an environment where the middle speaks, where the middle class now speaks up and say, please represent me and meet our national security needs. Make public investments in physical infrastructure and in human infrastructure like education and access to higher education. Please make public investments in research and development that will come up with the new ideas for the new jobs for this new economy in the 21st century. That's what they want us to be able to do. And for those of us here within this great institution called the United States Senate, and over on the other side, the House of Representatives, We have to be middle of the roaders. It is the middle, maybe a little to the center left or to the center right, but we have to be in the middle. Middle of the roaders are the ones that help bring us to this deal. I want to just thank those who put forth some other ideas during this debate. Senators Collins and Senator Klobuchar and the so-called Group of 12, they had some very interesting ideas. And as we go forward on implementing the deal, we should take a look at some of them. But they helped create a climate and a tone where people showed that they wanted to be pragmatic. And they also wanted to be patriotic, which is to make sure that the esteem of the United States government continues to take hold both among our own people and around the world. I want to be sure that we all work together. I fear that the middle-of-the-road legislator could be an endangered species. I hope not. I hope the middle-of-the-roaders don't become roadkill. And we can show that right now, because it's not only the deal that's been made, we must vote on the deal and we must pass the deal, and then we need to implement it. But America and its government cannot go from one crisis to another. We cannot govern by crisis. We cannot govern by one party or the other extorting it from the other, my way or I'll shut it down. We have to show that we are a deliberative body. We have to show that we are a nation of laws and rules, not of people, personalities, and pundits. We have to show that. So I compliment those that have been voices of moderation and voices for creating the climate to bring us there. I'd also like to thank our leadership for willing to step up to the plate and be leaders. I would like to thank Senators Reid and Senators McConnell for the leadership and statesmanship that they showed. We were on the brink of brinkmanship. We had enough of gamemanship, and they stepped forward and showed us what statesmanship is. So I want to thank them for what they did. Now for me, I say this. I chair the Appropriations Committee. That, I'm not a solo act. I have wonderful subcommittee chairmen, 12 subcommittee chairmen. They are eager and itching to go to work. I have an outstanding Republican conservative as my vice chairman, Senator Shelby of Alabama. We want to work. We want to work together, and we want to work with civility, mutual respect, get the job done. And I want to say to my friends on the other side of the dome, we want to govern. We want to govern wisely. We want to govern efficiently, and we want to govern respectfully. So I say to my colleagues on my side who've elected me the chair of this committee, you can count on me to do my best. I say to those on the other side of the aisle, you can count on me to continue to run an inclusive committee of discussion, open debate, amendments, so that we can really move our process forward, where everybody feels included, everybody has their say, everybody has their day. And at the end, though, of the day, we will vote. And to my colleagues on the other side of the dome, let's really work together. We have shown in the past that we know how to talk with each other, we know how to listen to each other, we can get the job done. I believe America wants us to get on with it. They want to be able to have a government that they can count on. They want to be able to have a government that works as hard as they do. And they want to have a United States Congress that acts really in the interest of the nation and of the next generation and not of the next election. So, Mr. President, I'm ready to vote for the agreement arrived at by our leadership. I'm ready to go to work, and I'm ready to do everything I can to make sure that we follow the middle of the road, that sensible center, and to make sure the American middle class has their day and their say. Mr. President, I yield the floor. and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
With the government shutdown in its third week, Senate Republicans and Democrats have reached an agreement on a plan to reopen the government and extend the nation's borrowing limit. The New York Times writes that the deal yielded virtually no concessions to the Republicans, other than some minor tightening of income verifications for people obtaining subsidized insurance under the new health care law. Under the agreement, the government would be funded through January 15th, and the debt ceiling would be raised until February 7th. Also, the Senate will take up a separate motion to instruct the House and Senate negotiators to reach accord by December 13th on a long-term blueprint for tax and spending policies over the next decade. Wanted to read a few comments from viewers on our Facebook page about the agreement. David writes, I support the Senate's proposal. The Tea Party can destroy the full faith and credit of the U.S. in January if this doesn't work. Another one from Linda, it's about time. Obamacare isn't good, and I agree with the Republicans. However, you can't stop the process of financial responsibility. One from Savage, yes, they need to agree because they're not thinking about less fortunate people. They do not care because they have money to take care of their kids. And the last one from Facebook, Melantha writes, Ted and the TPs lost, that's the Tea Partiers, now he stands alone. Let us know what you think about the pending deal between Senate Republicans and Democrats. You can write your comments at facebook.com/cspan.
Mr. President.
I'd be happy to talk. The senator from Pennsylvania.
Mr. President, I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today on a day when we are ever hopeful that we'll be able to complete legislation tonight that will remove the threat of a default, as well as to open up the government and to allow us to go forward now with negotiations on short-term budget issues for the next year and even beyond that. So I'm confident that that will happen. We'll be able to complete most of or all of the work tonight. But I think in a larger sense why it's vitally important that we get this agreement effectuated is because there are an awful lot of people out there that have been hurting for several reasons. We've had a recovering economy, but job growth hasn't moved fast enough. We still have, by way of example, in Pennsylvania, over 500,000 people out of work. At last count, 501,000 Pennsylvanians out of work. The percentage number really doesn't tell you much. It's been hovering around 7.5% or a little higher for a long while yet, but more than 500,000 people out of work is devastating. As the presiding officer knows, in his state of Ohio, we have a lot of similarities in terms of our workforce. And when I go across Pennsylvania, we have sometimes the biggest urban areas like Philadelphia still having high unemployment numbers, and sometimes very small counties having an equally high percent of people out of work. My home area of northeastern Pennsylvania still far too many people out of work. So when you add a tough economy still for a lot of people, plus the impact of the indiscriminate across-the-board cuts by way of sequestration, which I believe is bad public policy. We'll talk more about that later, and it'll be the subject of greater debate than it's been. And then you add, thirdly, the impact of a shutdown, and then number 4, you add the perilously close time that we're living through right now, where we're close to a default. So for all those reasons, it's been a difficult period for the country and a very difficult period for those who are trying to make ends meet every day. We have a chance in the next couple of hours to vote in a manner that will lift some of that anxiety, some of that worry. I was here this weekend on the floor talking about a letter I had received from a woman in northeastern Pennsylvania. She talked about her circumstance and her husband's circumstance as a result of the government shutdown. But then she talked about her parents, ages 85 and 83. And here's what she said in the letter. She said they, referring to her parents, they should not have this uncertainty. These should be their golden years. It breaks my heart to hear my mother saying she can't sleep and has a stomachache from the worry about where our country is headed. Middle and low-income families cannot afford another economic downturn. We are just barely recovering from the last one, unquote. So that letter that came from northeastern Pennsylvania, I think, spoke for people across our state and across our country, what people have been living through, trying to recover from the recession of several years ago and then being hit with a government shutdown and the coming to the brink of default. So for all those reasons, what we hope is that the work that's done today, the compromise agreement that Majority Leader Reid and Republican Leader McConnell entered into becomes the consensus not only here in the Senate but in the House as well. No legislation can remove all of the anxiety and the worry that people have, but certainly it'll provide some measure of relief for families like that. We had another story that came across yesterday, a family in Pennsylvania led by the mother of this family, Kelly Brown, her name is, and she's got 4 children. Her ages, the children's ages are 17, 14, and she has 2 9-year-old twins. The story was in the Pottstown Mercury, as it actually was Tuesday, October 15th, the Pottstown Mercury. And Kelly's story is emblematic of the impact of the shutdown, just the shutdown itself, what that did to her. She's in an apartment in southeastern Pennsylvania with her 4 children. She was moving along the path to get a mortgage, to move into a house kind of one county over, not too far from where she was living. But then, as the story says in the first couple of graphs of the story, quote, then the government shutdown froze her mortgage. And over the weekend, the home seller notified Kelly Brown that she couldn't wait any longer, unquote. That's what the story tells us. And for the record, Mr. President, I would ask that a story entitled Government Shutdown Could Leave Single Mom Kids Homeless, Pottstown Mercury, dated October 15th of this year.
Without objection, so ordered.
I'll put that on the record. But we're working with Kelly now to see if we can't be helpful. But the point is, she should never have had to go through that anxiety and worry, and maybe